So, good evening. I would like to welcome you to this evening's webinar session, which is about the current Schools White Paper and SEND consultation. I'm really happy to see all of you here this evening. So to introduce myself, my name is Sharon Smith. I'm the Policy and Parliamentary Lead at the Down Syndrome Association. This evening it's just me. Normally when we run these webinars we have two or sometimes three or more of us here with people helping behind the scenes, but due to people being on leave and various other reasons, it is just me this evening. So if you can bear with me while I multitask and do all of the different functions for this webinar. So welcome. I'm really pleased to be here with you all this evening. So in terms of what this session is about, I'm wanting to provide you with some additional support to help you respond to the SEND consultation. Now, the SEND consultation document itself is very long, and there are also 39 questions. So I'm going to give you, obviously we only have an hour this evening, and I can't go through everything in detail. So I'm going to be just touching on some of the information and hopefully giving you some guidance and support as to even where just to start, but also how to approach some questions if you find things a little bit tricky. So I'm going to be talking about what the consultation questions are asking. So I'm going to go through and talk about different sections of the consultation paper, but also talk about maybe what's not included fully, where maybe there's quite a bit of detail missing, but you can still comment on those things. I'm going to also highlight where we've identified and other organisations have identified risks to existing rights, and also where you might want to be commenting about fairness and equity in some of the questions as well. But what I'm not going to be doing is giving you a template of answers. I'm not going to be telling you how you should respond to the consultation, what you should say, because it's really important that your own experience shapes your response and that it feels and is authentic to you, to your child or young person as well. So in terms of this session, it is being recorded and it will be shared on our website and YouTube channel. So you will be able to watch it again afterwards. The chat is disabled, which helps me a lot, seeing as it's just me this evening here. But the question and answer function is available to you. If you can't see that along the sort of control panel, if you click on the sort of three dots and more, hopefully you'll find it in there. I do have it open on my second screen, so I will keep looking at it in case there's any questions come in while I'm talking, but hopefully there'll be time at the end where I can also respond to any other questions that are posed in there. If you have any other feedback, any thoughts, any questions, then you can email me on the policy email address, which I've put on the slide here as well. Or if you just go to the main Down Syndrome Association website and use the info at email address and address it for Sharon, it will reach me. So feel free to get in touch with me if whilst you're filling in the consultation you have any questions, or you just want some clarity, or you want to understand maybe what the DSA has said on a couple of the things, and then just let me know and I'll do whatever I can to help. We have today published a blog post on our website, and so I'm thinking it's on the homepage, but it's certainly in the policy section of the website, which gives an overview of some of the key messages that we're going to be putting into our response, because I think I'm about 95% of the way through drafting our response to be able to submit it. So what is the SEND consultation? It's long awaited. We've been waiting for many years for there to be reforms to the SEND and alternative provision system. And the previous government started this process in around about 2019. And then obviously we had a general election and a new government, and they have been working on scoping out what they want to do in relation to addressing what's seen and widely recognised as a crisis for children with special educational needs and disabilities in the education system. So the SEND consultation itself is asking for people's views on the white paper and also on the consultation document. So there's two documents that really you can read side by side to see the overall intention from the government. But I'm going to give a very brief overview on the next slide anyway. The consultation process is currently open till the 18th of May at 11:59 p.m. So you need to get your response in by then. And you can respond there's an online form, or there is also an email address. Again, we've shared that email address several times on our social media accounts. If you can't find it, get in touch with me and I'll let you know what that is. And what has been confirmed by the Minister who's responsible for these reforms, Georgia Gould, is that if email responses are sent in, they can be written or non-written responses. So if you're wanting to send in something that is not in a traditional format, then email is the way to do that. And it may be that if you're supporting a young person who has Down syndrome to engage in this process, and there is an easy read document, you might want to send in, I don't know, video from them, or some of their writing if they've written something by hand and you want to sort of scan that in or photograph it and send that, then there is that flexibility. Now, the government have said that AI will be used to analyse responses. So all we can say, oh, there's a typo there, I do apologise, is to make yours as distinctive as possible, which is one of the reasons why we're not telling you what you should be saying or suggesting what your responses should be, because the more responses that are, as I say, authentic, the better. Now, it's really important to note this is still a consultation, and at this stage, nothing in the law has changed and existing legal rights remain in force. So if your school or your local authority are telling you differently, then you can remind them that this is only a white paper and a consultation. So in terms of the proposals, the white paper is broader than just special educational needs and disability. And it sets out a sort of 10-year vision that our current government have for the whole education system. But within that, they've also set out their proposals for reforming special educational needs and disabilities provision as well. In addition to the white paper, as I've said, there is a SEND consultation document where they have focused and put to varying levels, different level of detail about some of the proposals that they have. And I'll come on to explain a little bit more about where there maybe are some gaps or things that are not yet fully fleshed out. What they're proposing, though, generally is a greater focus on mainstream inclusion. They want to see more children educated in their local schools with the right support. So this isn't just a case of bringing children in and hopefully it's not leaving them to fail without adequate support. So it's about boosting mainstream inclusion, so supporting teachers through additional training. They're talking about having teams of specialist advisors called experts at hand that each school can access. Those specialist advisors, for instance, speech therapists, occupational therapists, education psychologists, will come into school, maybe do some group work or some observations, upskill teachers, etc. They're proposing that there'll be a move away from our current system of SEND support and EHCPs to new targeted layers of support. So they'll have the universal offer for all children, and then there will be targeted plus, and specialist. Now, specialist doesn't necessarily mean special school or inclusion basis. It's just that that child or that young person needs specialist provision that's over and above what mainstream school would normally provide within that sort of expert at hand offer. They're proposing some changes to eligibility for education, health and care plans, introducing some new specialist provision packages, which are in effect commissioning tools that they will be using local authorities will use to commission local provision. It's not yet clear how those specialist provision packages are going to work for children who need an EHCP, who want to be and can be educated in mainstream school. And we know that lots of children who have Down syndrome can be successfully included and educated in mainstream school. So that's one of the gaps, and it might be something as we come on and look at the questions that you think, actually, I want to comment on what that could look like for my child, if that's something that's important to you. They're looking at introducing new funding mechanisms, new accountability structures, Restrictions on parental preference in terms of placement. One aspect of that is that local authorities will give parents a list of settings that they have already identified that will be suitable for delivering those specialist provision packages. Again, how that works with mainstream school is still a little bit unclear, but what they would be doing if you're wanting specialist provision is identifying which special schools in the local area can provide the specialist provision packages that your child needs. They're proposing some changes to tribunal powers, including the fact that at the moment, SENDIST can basically order the local authority to name a particular setting, and they're proposing that they will move away from that, and that the tribunal will only be able to tell local authorities to go back and reconsider their decision. So that's a reduction in rights. And alongside all of this, once this obviously goes through, if it goes through, they'll be looking to revise the code of practice and also Ofsted inspection criteria. So as I've said, the key information, the date you need to be aware of is basically a week on Monday, 18th of May at 11:59 p.m. You need to get your response in by then. All of the consultation documents are on the government website, but we also have got a dedicated schools white paper page on our website, and we have linked to all of the documents. So the main consultation document, the white paper, easy read, the easy read form, the BSL version. We have all of those linked from our website. As I've said, these responses will inform the government's next steps in terms of what are their final proposals, what will they put into any bill that will go then through Parliament to change aspects of existing legislation. And anyone can respond to this consultation: families, young people, practitioners, organisations, and also others that are expert in the sector. So this is the link to our white paper page. It is worth going and having a look at that, because there's links to previous webinars that we've done, which also go into more of the detail about some of the proposals. We don't have time to do that this evening. So why does your response matter? Well, we at the DSA are putting in our response, and it is a very, very comprehensive response. I've spent the last, I don't know how many days and weeks writing it, drafting it. And it goes, I think it's about 80 pages long at the moment. Now, you don't have to submit anything that extensive. Your response matters because lived experience matters. It's really important evidence. It helps those people who are making policy decisions understand what the impact of the proposals can or will be on children and young people. Now, the government are implementing these reforms because they want to improve things for children, young people and their families, and they want to improve outcomes for our children as well. Now, there are other pressures, as we know. They're also wanting to address the challenge that local authorities have at the moment with increasing costs, rising costs relating to SEND. So there are two aspects of this here. It's around affordability within the system, but also this government has said that they are committed to improving outcomes as well for our children. So consultations are really important in terms of being able to shape what the future law and potential guidance looks like. And I've put on the slide here, silence carries risk. The risk to not responding is that if we don't respond to the consultation and there are aspects of it that we disagree with, then our silence can look like we're happy with everything that's being proposed, because often the people who respond to these things are actually responding because they're unhappy with something. So there may well be aspects of these proposed reforms that you really support and are very happy with, and it's important that you say that. And then there will be other aspects potentially where you might have some concerns or even just some questions. You might be able to say, well, I don't really understand what that means for my child. And until I have that information, I can't comment on this. So consultations are not just looking for people to agree and disagree, but they also want to understand what could go wrong. If these proposals are implemented, what are the risks? What are the dangers? What are the things? Which group of children or young people might be most disadvantaged if this goes ahead? They also want to think and gather evidence on, well, what haven't we thought about? And again, this is where your lived experience really matters, because people who are working in the Department for Education and ministers, I would imagine most of them don't have children or young people who have Down syndrome. And so your experience, your child's experience, is really important in terms of being able to feed in and say, well, you haven't thought about this, or what happens if this happens? So we also want to be able to talk about what are the unintended consequences, what are the things that might go wrong if this policy goes ahead, even if it is really well intentioned. Now, as I've said, you don't have to agree with everything. You can say to some of the aspects, some of the questions, you can say, I do not agree with this proposal, or this wouldn't work for my child. You don't have to be contributing to support something that you're opposing, and you don't have to answer as though the decision has already been made. And I think this is particularly important for the Easy Read document if you are supporting a young person, because some of the wording within the Easy Read document makes it sound as though the decisions have already been made. And I think it's really important that any young person who has a learning disability, who's engaging with this process and is reading that Easy Read document and is being supported to engage in this process, understands that this is still a consultation. So even though there are comments in there saying this is what is going to happen, then actually none of this is necessarily going to happen. It's still very much open at the moment. So if there is an aspect of it that is detailed and you don't agree with it, and the question is saying, how could this work? You don't have to give them an answer that tells them how it could work. You could just simply say, I don't agree with that. For example, you might say, I don't agree with specialist provision packages, and then explain why. You don't have to answer a question to say how they could work in practice if you don't think they could, or if you just disagree with them completely in principle. Now, some questions might feel more difficult than others because they might feel that maybe you don't have the knowledge to answer them. As I've said, there are some questions that the way they're worded, it makes it sound that if you answer that question, it's because you agree with what they're proposing. It might use technical language, or it might feel that it's something you can't possibly know around some of the potential implementation. I need to put my teeth back in. Some of the potential implementation of these reforms. So it might say, well, how could this work in a classroom? Or one of the examples that I can give you is it talks about schools coming together and working in local groups. And there are some questions about the implementation of that and what could go wrong. And it may well be that you don't have a view on that. And it's okay to say that too. Some of the questions might not reflect your child's reality. So there may be assumptions written into some of those questions. And you say, well, actually, that's not how I understand our education system to work, or that's not been our experience. And again, it is really important to say those things if you can in response to those questions. And some of the questions might feel particularly difficult because they leave out some of the important safeguards. So they don't talk about legal rights, for example. They might talk about aspects of things that are going to change, but not necessarily talk about, well, what protections will be in place or what will the routes of redress be for that. And some of the questions I would say in this consultation are actually quite vague. Some of the proposals are vague, some of the questions are quite vague, and that can make it really hard to respond to in a way that you feel confident and informed. So you don't have to respond to everything, but it is worth sort of, if you can, spending some time thinking about, well, what do these questions mean? So if it does feel too difficult, if a question does feel too technical, you can just respond from your experience. You can talk about how you think it might affect your child, or had this been in place when your child was younger, what the impact would have been. And you can also just talk about what's currently working for your child that you think needs to be maintained, or what is not working for your child and therefore needs to change. And you can include any ideas you have for what you think would work better. And you don't have to necessarily talk about just what they're proposing. You could say, well, I think it would be really great if we could have XYZ. So just a couple of examples. One of the things that we've put into our recommendations is that we think that there should be a return to a sort of key worker programme where there is a key worker who will support families to navigate the system and to basically be like a sort of project manager so that families don't have to do it. We've been running some focus groups over the last few weeks, and parents have clearly told us that they just want to be parents and they don't want to be project managers and having to hold everybody to account. So we've put in a recommendation, well, maybe this key worker role could be reinstated. Equally, we've talked about how at the moment there are specialist teachers for hearing impairment and visual impairment and physical disability. We're not suggesting necessarily that there needs to be specialist teachers for Down syndrome, but maybe there is a specialist support around inclusion of children who have learning disabilities, for example. And we know that lots of local support groups across the country employ ex-teachers or parents that have become particularly knowledgeable and skilled to go into schools and offer outreach. Well, maybe that's something that if they want to, if they're being serious about having more children who have Down syndrome in mainstream school, maybe that's something that they could be looking to invest in. They're just two ideas that we've included, and I'm not suggesting you have to include those in your response at all. But instead, what do you think would make a difference to you? What would have made a difference to you and your child? So you don't have to use policy language, you don't have to use the acronyms, you don't have to sound clever or technical, you don't have to suggest detailed alternatives. So if you are suggesting something and say, well, it would be great if we'd have had this, you don't have to come up with a full-blown proposal for what that would look like. And you don't have to sound like an expert any more than being the expert in your child's experience and your child's life and your role as the parent, which obviously is an expert role. But what I'm saying is you don't have to talk like a professional or use particular language to respond to these consultations. Be authentic to yourself and to your experience and to your child. That's the most important thing. So, as I said briefly before, some of the questions will assume that the reforms are going to happen, and they might then just be talking about how do you think this might work in practice? Now, on those questions, you could have some ideas about how it might work in practice. You might say, I think it could work in practice like this, but only if you put these protections in place. For example, you could say, I think that the schools list, you might think that's a really good idea. And you might say, but it needs the backstop of a tribunal being able to name a setting if, if there's a disagreement between the parent and the local authority. So it may be that you give a conditional support and some ideas about how things can be implemented. But if you just completely disagree with the premise of what's being suggested, you can say that. You can say, I don't agree with this. I don't think this should work, or this could work, or I think this is unfair, or whatever it is. You could say this is a reduction in legal rights, and I'm absolutely opposed to that. Whatever the question is, you are able to do that in your response. You can challenge the assumptions if there's underlying assumptions. You can explain why it wouldn't work from your perspective and describe any risks or consequences. As I said, you don't have to support the implementation of any of these proposals if you disagree with them. But equally, if you do agree with them and you've got some, as I say, some sort of conditions to that, or you want to say, well, I agree with this, but then feel free to obviously do that too. So there are 39 questions. As I mentioned at the beginning, it's really long and it can take a really long time to get your head around it. You don't have to answer every single question, as I've said. And it may well be that if you do choose to answer every question, you might just want to write 1 or 2 lines. You don't have to do pages and pages and pages like I've done for the DSA's response. Just giving your overall feedback, your thoughts is absolutely fine. So the first 4 questions are really talking about the purpose, the ambition, the aim of these reforms, and they're really looking at the direction of travel, and also how they're defining success. So you might want to look at whether you think that the outcomes they're talking about or the success and the way they're talking about the reforms is what matters to you. You might here as well want to comment on changes and accountability. So there are some aspects there you might just say, well, I'm not happy with this. So it's worth doing, as I've done on these slides, sort of taking the questions in chunks, because they're sort of, you can see that there are topics that are sort of bunched together, and you can then look at those questions all together in the round and then maybe build your response across several questions. The next group of questions, questions 5 to 10, are talking about early identification, early support. One of the things here that might be something you particularly want to talk about, even if you have an older child, is that they're proposing that there'll be a fast track route to getting an EHCP for children under the age of 5 who are already identified as having complex needs. So what they're suggesting is that, for example, if a child is born with a particular condition and they haven't talked about which conditions should be included in this, but where it's pretty clear that their needs are likely to be such that they will need an EHCP when they're in education, that there will be a fast track process. Now, this fast track process has not been fleshed out. There's no real information about it. You might want to comment on that. You might want to say whether that's something you would have liked. You might want to talk about who maybe could refer into that fast track process, whether it should only be medical professionals, whether you think it could also be support groups, whether it could be health visitors, social workers, etc. Who do you think can make those referrals? Should parents be able to self-refer into that fast track? You might also want to say, well, if the fast track's only up to the age of 5, what happens about older children who maybe don't have any HCP? So, for instance, people coming to the country, or people, don't know, for whatever reason, haven't yet had an EHCP, and then get to the age of 6 or 7 and need one. Most children, obviously, who have Down syndrome have an EHCP by the time they're 5, 6, or 7, but not all. You might want to talk here about what happened to your child in terms of those early years in education. What did it look like for your child around, did you receive portage? Was that helpful? Was it not helpful? Or were you in an area where portage wasn't available, and what were the implications? How were you supported in the early years? How was your child supported? When they went to preschool, they might have gone to a childminder. What did that look like? And also to think about what was missing, what worked well for you, but also what was missing. What would you like to see in the reforms? There are some potential risks here that, again, you might want to highlight. You might want to talk about the fact that sometimes needs can be identified, but provision isn't always put in place immediately. This is something we've been hearing about quite a bit in our focus groups over the last few weeks. And also that with the move that they're proposing to move to specialist provision packages, and also obviously these different layers of support, is support going to be dependent on thresholds rather than individually assessed needs? So there's quite a lot to unpick in these few questions around early support. Now, obviously, early identification for children who have Down syndrome tends to be antenatally or not long after birth. So that might be something that you could just briefly comment on, but really that means early support is something that is very important for our children, making sure that they get access to those therapies from the earliest years. Then questions 11 to 18 are very much looking at mainstream inclusion and specialist support. They're also talking about accountability. So these are questions that are talking about how support is meant to work in mainstream education, and also how they're anticipating systems might work together. So there's not a lot of detail, again, in this consultation about how health and social care are going to be involved. There's sort of brief mentions of it, but there's not a lot of detail. So again, that might be something you want to comment on. Your experiences of securing social care support for your child or young person. Have you been able to? Has it been useful? How has health impacted on your child? So, what are their health needs? How has health and education worked together or not? But also, this is looking at as well these local groups of schools and how are they going to work together. So, it could just be within these questions that you talk about your experience about the support your child has had, waiting times? Have you had to wait for additional assessments? Have you had to wait for provision to be put in place? Has the provision you've received been sufficient in your view, or has it not been enough? Have you been passed around between health and social care and education and back to health again? And also within these questions, you might want to talk about, well, what does inclusion mean to you? There is not within this, again, within this consultation, there isn't a clear definition of what inclusion looks like. So there is no clear, in fact, there's quite a lot of areas where there's no definitions at all. So they're talking about complex needs, and it's children with the most complex needs who are going to still be eligible for education, health, and care plans. But there's no definition of complex needs. And equally, there's no definition of inclusion. So, what does inclusion mean to you, and how can inclusion be measured? And is inclusion only possible in mainstream settings, or actually was your child more included in a specialist provision? Within these questions as well, you might want to, if your child has experience of resource provisions or units or bases, which are now called inclusion bases going forward, you might want to talk about your experiences there too. Did they work for your child? Were there challenges? What was good about them? What was bad about them? So again, there's lots within these sort of 7 or so questions to unpick. Excuse me. Now, these are the questions 19 to 27, really looking at placement, information, choice. So this is where some of those points might come out around whether you found it easy to secure a place in the setting that your child is at. Now, that might be a mainstream setting, as I've said, might be a specialist setting. Your young person might be in residential college. You might be wanting them to go to residential college. Have you had to go to tribunal to secure those places? How were decisions made? Was there transparency? Were the local authority really clear? And was there co-production and engagement with you and your child or young person? So what does choice currently look like? And what were your experiences of securing a school or college place for your child or young person? So you might want to here think about what made the difference with the school that your child is at compared to maybe other schools that you went to visit. What information did the school have, I don't know, in their brochure or on their website or on the information days and open days, that helped you think, well, that's the school where I want my child to go? Or what maybe put you off? Because sometimes information can also put you off wanting to go and visit a school or a setting. Was there any gatekeeping by schools or local authorities? Was there any illegal practice that you're aware of? And you can also comment within these questions about whether you agree or disagree with the local authority providing that list of placements to choose from that I mentioned earlier. And with all of this, if you're making comments to say why you agree with something or why you don't, it's important to say why if you can. You don't have to. You could just say, I completely oppose this, and that's enough. You don't have to give any more detail, but it will be helpful for them to understand why, if there are reasons, why you oppose things. Then we have questions 28, 35, and this is very much around this sort of collaboration between schools and different settings. And the big vision that is set out in this school's white paper and the SEND consultation, as I've said, is that They want every school to be part of a multi-academy trust. So they want every single school to be part of that bigger trust body. And what they're proposing is that at the moment there's quite a lot of schools that are still what's called maintained, which means the local authority is responsible for the running of those schools, the overall responsibility. But because their vision is that they want every school to be in a trust, for the first time ever, they're proposing local authorities can set up their own trusts and their own groups of schools. So is that something you agree with? Is it something you disagree with? Is your child at a trust, an academy trust? Has that worked well for you? Has that not worked well? How do you find collaboration between schools? Do you think that it can work in practice, that special schools and alternative provision can come and deliver outreach to mainstream schools, for example? And how do you think that schools might work together to make some group decisions around maybe these expert hands in terms of that local provision of speech therapists and outreach and OTs and EPs, etc.? So again, here you can think about, well, what was it that made collaboration work for my child? Or what was broken? What fell down? At what time? What was the cause of that? What went wrong? So what is the difference between a good experience and a bad experience? And what are your views on potentially where there could be better practice, where schools potentially can support each other better, they can develop expertise in a particular area, and there can be outreach and a little bit more sort of fluidity between those school settings. So it's worth again thinking about whether that works for you, whether it doesn't work for you. Then we've got a few questions almost at the end of the questions. And these are about complaints, disagreement, and redress. So when things go wrong. And what they're proposing is that education, health, and care plans will still exist for those who have the most complex needs. But the provision, instead of being the education provision being detailed in the education, health, and care plan, the education provision will be detailed in an individual support plan that's written with and by the school. Those individual support plans, schools will have a legal duty to produce those with parents, but in terms of delivery of them or adequacy of them, you won't be able to go to tribunal as you can currently with an education, health, and care plan. So there is a definite change here in terms of that redress when things go wrong, when you're disagreeing. Other things you might want to consider here is, well, does that mean you could potentially be in conflict with your child's school? And what are the implications for that? Rather than being in conflict with the local authority, but still having a really positive relationship with the school. So what they're proposing is that the school's complaint process will be enhanced. So if you are not happy with the ISP, the individual support plan, you can complain through the school's complaint process, which will be teacher, SENCO, head teacher, governors. And then if you're still not happy, there'll be an independent or a more independent panel, which will have a SEND expert on it. Now that could be a SENCO from another school. Apart from that, we don't know who else it could be, but it's somebody who's perceived to be a SEND expert. So this is something that will be a change in legal rights, basically, if this goes through. I've already talked about the scope of the tribunal changing. This is one of the places where you can comment on that. You might want to talk about if you went to tribunal or if you use mediation. There's not an awful lot of content about mediation either. You might want to talk about what went well, what went wrong, what impact it had on your child, what impact it had on you. Did you secure the outcomes that you needed for your child, etc. So this is where you're able to put all of those questions. And then we come to question 39. And I've put here, this is the catch-all. Now, this is where you can go back over key points. You can emphasize things that you've already said. It's okay to repeat things in different questions. That's fine. You can bring it together to say, well, actually, if all of these things are put into place, this is the impact for my child. So obviously the consultation document itself has broken down different elements that they're asking on, but not really looking at that bigger picture. Well, what does that mean for my child? If all of this happens, what do I think that means for me? What do I think that's going to mean for my child? And then you can talk about that here in question 39. This is also an opportunity for you to raise issues or talk about things that are positive that you don't feel fit into any of the other questions. So some of the things that you might want to talk about here again is around some of those changes to rights. You might again want to reiterate about the tribunal safeguards. There isn't a specific question about tribunal, which is why I've suggested you might want to put it in here, but also maybe in some of those other questions that I've just talked about. You might want to talk about some of the cultural barriers to inclusion. So again, a lot of the consultation response questions and the responses they're encouraging are about process. But actually, we know that attitudes can sometimes be the make or break as to whether a child is included in a school. So, whether the school leader is really committed to inclusion or whether an individual teacher has gone above and beyond for your child. So, you might want to talk about some of the things that have gone really well and what made the difference. But also, again, what are those barriers that maybe you've faced? And if your child started in mainstream but then moved to specialist provision, was there a trigger point? Was there something that happened? Was it that the school said they couldn't meet need? So there's lots of things that you can put into question 39. And there are, as I've said, there are lots of areas that really are either not talked about or not talked about a lot in the consultation document. Now, post 16 and preparation for adulthood is mentioned. I think it's question 17 off the top of my head, but don't quote me on that. There is a question about transition, but this is an opportunity for you to talk about preparation for adulthood, for you to talk about what's the role of adult social care. If you have a young person who's going through this process now or has been through it, what did that look like for you? What reform would you like to see happening? The other thing that isn't mentioned within the consultation document is EOTAS. So that's education other than at school or at college. So it's EOTAS. They've said that EOTAS is going to stay the same. It's not written in the same consultation document, but we have been told in various events that EOTAS is not changing. But is it possible for EOTAS not to change if EHCPs are changing and if the criteria and eligibility for an EHCP is going to be closely linked to those specialist provision packages? How does that work with EOTAS? How does individual assessment work for a child? You might want to be asking about workforce. Is there a sufficient workforce to deliver all of the plans? Is there sufficient funding? There's lots of things that you could bring into this question if you think that actually there's lots you want to say, but you don't know where to put it. Then question 39 is potentially the place to put all of that. Now, as I've mentioned a few times, and this is one of the things, we're not telling you what to say, far from it, but we do want to highlight the fact that we are concerned that there is a potential for weakening of enforceable rights, particularly with the shift with EHCPs and moving provision into the individual support plan. Narrowing access to education, health and care plans. The government have been very explicit about that. They want to have, they're not saying they want to have fewer children who have EHCPs, but what they're wanting to do is stop this huge growth that is being seen. So they're anticipating that when these reforms come in, if they come in the way they're being proposed, that the number of EHCPs will continue to rise for a number of years and then it will drop back down to the current level. So they are absolutely trying to stem the growth in the number of EHCPs that are being applied for. And the eligibility for EHCPs will now be associated with whether you meet the criteria for these specialist provision packages or not. So that is a definite shift. You might want to talk about that in your response. So some of the legal duties potentially are changing. Now they are proposing there'll be national inclusion standards, there'll be guidance for inclusion bases, etc. But do we feel confident enough that what they're proposing for mainstream education is enough in terms of protecting our children and their education if they're also going to reduce rights at the same time? And there seems to be overall slightly less accountability built into the system. And what parents have consistently telling us at the DSA is actually they want more accountability, not less. So again, that might be something you want to talk about within your response. But as I've said, completely up to you. We're not trying to shape how you respond to this. As I've said, not everything that is being proposed has a question that it easily relates to. Some of the major changes being proposed sit completely outside of those questions. So there isn't a question that directly asks about centre tribunal changes, and there isn't really explicit content or any questions that ask you whether you're happy for those reduced rights in terms of moving provision and specific provision from Section F in an education, health and care plan into an ISP that can then only be challenged through the school route rather than tribunal and local authorities. There are other areas that are included, but they're just not discussed in depth in terms of what the proposals are. So post-16 and transition to adulthood is one of those areas. There is not an awful lot of detail that basically, so you don't really know what they're proposing. Now, we know that the framework, the general framework that they've set out for schools is intended to go into early years and into post-16, but there's no detail about what that looks like. There's no detail about whether they're going to make further education colleges more inclusive. How are they going to be maybe more ambitious for young people who have Down syndrome? We know at the moment there's quite limited further education options for some of our young people, so you might want to talk about that. There's also, as I've already said, there is no detail about what specialist provision packages might look like if it's a mainstream setting. And I know from various conversations we've had with the DFE, this is an area they're still looking to develop. So it's an opportunity, if you have some ideas, how could these provision packages work in a mainstream setting? Or you might say, I don't see how they can work in a mainstream setting, and that's equally okay to say. And then, as I've said, some areas such as the OTAS are just completely missing. They're not mentioned at all. And so these are the things you might want to weave into other questions, or you could put in question 39. Now, it is okay to answer questions sideways or to give a politician's answer. So there could be a question and you think, well, actually, that's not the question I want to answer at all. I want to talk about this. It's linked, it's related, but it's not what you're asking me. And that's okay to do as well. You might want to repeat a key message, for instance, about legal rights or about the tribunal or about post-16 across several different questions. And you might want to say the same thing in different questions, and that's absolutely fine to do as well. You could highlight what you think is missing. What have they not thought about? What have they not taken into consideration? What areas are important to you and your family that are just not mentioned at all? If you think rights are going to be weakened and you're not happy with that, say so. And talk about what you think might be lost or gained. This should say lost or gained in practice. So you might think there's a huge opportunity with some of the reforms, but you don't think they've necessarily got the idea of how to deliver that, and you might then be able to share some of your ideas. You might have had an idea about how to reshape education for learners who have Down syndrome, and you've had that idea for years and had nowhere to actually share it. This could be your opportunity. So it's not always about just commenting on things that you disagree with or that you think are not going to work. You might have some ideas that you want to share as well. And it is also okay to say, I don't know. You're asking me this question and I just don't know. I don't have enough information to answer this. I need more detail. I don't know what this would mean for my child. this is not something that reflects my experience, and this isn't something that captures the reality. This doesn't relate to our life and our reality. And that is also really important for the policymakers to hear as well. So feel free to use some or all of these phrases. Now, in terms of what we're doing, we have been meeting with officials from the Department for Education since before the white paper came out. We have, over recent weeks, been running some focus groups where Claire Burton, who is the director of SEND and AP, has been coming along and meeting parents directly. So we've run 4 focus groups so far. Each one of those has been 2 hours long. And that has been really valuable for Claire to have an opportunity to ask people questions, but also really to hear people's experiences. And at times those sessions have been quite emotional and have been quite hard hitting, but that also has been really important as well. And in terms of our response to the consultation, we're drawing on those events, the conversations that have taken place, to help shape our response. Now, we are responding formally to the consultation. As I said, we're probably 95% finished with that. I've got a few more bits to add in, and then I need to get that approved internally. And within that, we are raising shared concerns. We are also amplifying family voices as well. And in fact, in all of the meetings that we're going to, we're doing that. And one of the things we've also been attempting to do with this work as well is really to think about which families are underrepresented, and we've been proactively trying to include those underrepresented families and to be able to hear their voices and hear their unique experiences within all of this work as well. And we hope that our consultation response reflects their experiences as well as the people whose voices we always are able to hear. So in terms of just final reassurance, and then I will stop sharing my screen and see if there's any questions. I haven't got any in there at the moment, but feel free to post any questions if you have any. There is no perfect response. So this is not something that you can get wrong. There's no right or wrong way of going about this at all. And I think if there's one thing that you can take away from this evening, it's that. There's no one way that you should be responding or engaging with this consultation. Look at it from your perspective, your child's perspective, and think about what's important for you to say. And as I've said, you don't have to answer every question, and you don't have to have really long and detailed responses for each question either. You don't have to use jargon, you don't have to use official terms, you don't have to use acronyms. Just feel free to talk from the heart if that's the way you want to do it. It's absolutely fine. And in fact, that's often more powerful, I think, than official sort of sounding formal language. I think you probably, however long you spend on this, however many hours, if you do spend hours, you'll never manage to say everything that you want to say. And I would imagine as soon as you press submit, there's something else you want to say. What's important here is that this is not the final stage in this process. So even if this consultation, even if the proposals are going to go through and the Department for Education and the government decide not to change anything, they're going to do everything exactly as per this consultation, it still needs to go through Parliament. It still needs MPs to back this, and there will be a long, probably prolonged parliamentary process where there'll be very detailed scrutiny. There'll be a piece of legislation that will be laid, and then there will be lots and lots of amendments and discussions and different rounds of that. And it goes through the House of Commons and the House of Lords and then back to the Commons. So there will be opportunities to continue to influence. And if you feel really strongly about the proposals, then you can contact your MP. Lots of MPs at the moment are running round tables. The Council for Disabled Children have been running some online events and some in-person events, so you might want to have a look for those as well. So there's lots of opportunities to have your say, but what I'm also just trying to reassure you is that this isn't the final time. The 18th of May at 11:59 p.m. is not the shut up for you'll never be able to say anything again about this, because there'll be lots of other opportunities. But speaking up matters, and everyday examples are powerful, and your lived experience and your child's experience is really important evidence. So I do encourage you to respond and engage if you can. So that's me finished talking. Well, I'm going to look at your questions now. I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to move the questions screen across because I can see I've got three have come in. So bear with me. Okay, let me just move this across so I'm looking in the right place. So I have got a question here that says, can I respond as a mum? And then can my older son, who doesn't live at home but is a sibling, send in a response too? Yes, absolutely. What I would say is any children who also live with you can send in responses too. If you have a partner, your partner can send in a response too. So there is no restriction on who can and can't respond to this. Everybody in your household could send in their own response. The only thing I would say is don't send them in as identical responses because of the fact that AI is being used. It may well strip out where there's duplicate submissions. So just word it slightly differently, or think about the different perspectives that obviously your son, who is a sibling, might have different views about what worked for their sibling than you might as a parent. So just maybe sort of switch it up a little bit. A question here that says, 1 second, just needed to click that to say I've answered that one live. Can you save and come back to it, or does it have to be done in all in one go? I don't know the answer to that because I have done mine in a Word document and I'm planning on emailing it to the email address rather than submitting it online. There's a website, you may or may not be familiar with it, that's called Special Needs Jungle. And if you search through their website, they have a Word document that you can download that has all the questions on it. So what you can do is you can prepare your answers on that Word document and then either send that Word document by email, or you can then just quickly cut and paste your responses into the online form if it doesn't allow you to come back to it. But because I haven't tried the form, I don't know the answer to that. So I do apologise. But I suggest going to Special Needs Jungle, finding their downloadable 39 questions Word document and using that to work in until you're ready to submit, which is what I've been doing over the last couple of weeks. If you can't find that, then please just email me at the DSA and I'll get you the link, or I'll send you the Word document because I've probably got it stored somewhere without my answers in. So I hope that's okay. And then I've got another question that says, will we receive feedback from the government once they have assessed the responses? We should. I don't know is the answer to that. We should, absolutely we should. And this is a formal government consultation, which means that they should publish their response to it, absolutely. And I would imagine it's going to take several months for them to do the full analysis, because I've heard that they've already had over 2,000 responses so far, and I would imagine lots of people will be doing their responses sort of right up until the last deadline. I know lots of organisations and individuals that haven't yet finished their responses. So what I would say is yes, we should. The reason I'm hesitant about it is I just know that there have been other consultations where we haven't yet necessarily seen any responses published. So, for example, specifically related to this community, the Down Syndrome Act guidance consultation, we haven't seen anything yet from that consultation, and it took them quite a long time to also publish the findings from the call for evidence that actually took place in, I think, October 2022. So yes, they should provide feedback, but when they do that, don't know. And then I've got one more question that says approximately how long does it take to fill out on average, of course, because it depends on response length. Um, I mean, yes, it really depends, and it depends how many questions you want to answer. It depends how familiar you are with the proposals as well, because um, if you are just starting it fresh and you haven't read any of the documentation yet, and you've not maybe been on any webinars and listened to people talking about the reforms, it's going to take you a lot longer than it is if actually you know what you're wanting to say and respond, and what your views are about specialist provision packages, and what your views are about the tribunal on the named list. Um, how long has it taken me to do as I would say the DSA's one is quite comprehensive, and I've taken a lot of content from other consultations that we've done, but also our focus groups and our survey, and it has probably taken me a week. But that is way more than any response I would do as a parent myself, if that makes sense. I plan to have a look at this as long as I've got some time, and I will probably spend no more than a day on it. But not everybody has a day to spare. Everybody's busy. We've all got our own commitments, our children to look after. My daughter's 21, so I have a little bit more time because she can occupy herself a bit. So whatever time you can give, I would say, whatever you can answer. There are some individuals and organisations on social media who have put out information that might help. So again, I mentioned Special Needs Jungle before. They've put out several articles that you might want to read, which will help you understand some of the opportunities, but also some of the risks and challenges from the proposals. Then there is Rachel Filmer, who's Send Right Alliance. She has been posting videos on her Facebook addressing each of the questions, question by question, and so have at least one of the solicitors, the Send solicitors, I can't remember the name of the gentleman who's been doing it, but he's been going through the questions as well. So there is content out there on social media if you find it easier to watch videos rather than read the documents. But I would say, sorry, how long is a piece of string? I can't give a clear answer on how long. But even if you only have an hour and you can only answer 5 or 6 questions, it's best to do that than and get your concerns across or your opportunities across than not respond at all. So we do encourage you to engage if you can. So I've answered all of the questions. I'm just going to keep this open in case any more questions come in. And if there's none within a minute or so, then I am going to close the session and say thank you to all of you. Let me just wait 1 minute, see if there's anything else coming in. Please do contact me if I can help in any way. I work part-time for the DSA. Tuesdays to Thursdays, but I do tend to check my email on other days. And if I can help or signpost or send you a copy of the questions or whatever it is, then please let me know. I'm really, really happy to help you. Okay, there's no more questions coming in. So I'm going to say thank you all for joining this evening. Thank you for coming and listening to me talk to you for an hour. I hope it has been helpful. If you have any feedback on this session, I would welcome it. We want to make sure these webinars and sessions are really useful for all of you. And good luck. Good luck with filling out your response to the consultation. And we hope to see you all soon. Thank you very much. Bye.